Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Employee Handbooks Potential Revisions for 2021. I'm Anna Hobson from HR Simple, and I will be moderating today. Today's presenter is Emily from Fredrikson Byron. The presentation today will be about an hour long. If you have any questions, please submit them in the question box, and Emily will get to them at the end of the webinar. If you need more COVID-19 resources or would like to watch more webinars, please go to hrsimple.com/events. You can also go to youtube.com/hrsimple to view past webinars. HR Simple provides federal and state-specific manuals. We make employment law easy. Our books are written by top labor attorneys. Vacation policies, employee documentation, and how to fill out the I-9 form are just a few of the topics the manuals cover. To find out more or purchase, you can go to hrsimple.com/shop. Now we will take a little time to learn about Emily before we get started on the presentation. Emily defends employers against allegations of sex discrimination, age discrimination, race discrimination, FMLA and ADA violations, wrongful termination in violation of public policy, and tortious interference. To help employers maintain a productive workplace and avoid litigation, Emily partners with clients to provide supervisor and manager training, investigate internal discrimination complaints, provide reasonable accommodations to disabled employees, and navigate issues surrounding family and medical leave. Emily works with employers of all sizes and has experience with for-profit corporations, nonprofit organizations, and cooperatives. She also provides specialized advice and litigates on behalf of colleges and universities in disputes concerning faculty discipline, tenure and promotion, student conduct, and accommodation of students with disabilities. Prior to practicing law, Emily worked in higher education administration, supervising employees and getting director-level experience in student judicial affairs and residence life. So on that note, I'm going to pass things over to Emily so we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm going to go ahead and show my screen. And if you can verify that you're just seeing my first slide, that would be great.
It looks great.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you so much for all of you for being here today. I want to start by saying I really tried to have this presentation not be all about COVID and the pandemic and when are we going back to work and how COVID has changed the workplace. But of course, the way the workplace has changed in the last year really permeates everything you do as human resources professionals and everything I do as a management side employment attorney. It has been a tough year with not a lot of time for reflection, not a lot of time for strategy. So for the next 50 minutes or so before I start taking questions, we're going to talk about how these developments over the last year might impact your HR policies and your employee handbook, and changes your organization might be able to make to have a positive impact on the workplace, or perhaps more realistically, avoid some negative situations. So webinars are tricky things. Your urgent emails are right in front of you, and I admit my PowerPoint slides are not particularly exciting. I need to work on that. Even so, I hope you can focus in for a while and think about how some of this might be applicable to your organization, might cause you to look at some policies differently and make some changes. And I will certainly do my best to make it worth your time. So we're going to talk first, this is kind of our agenda for the next hour or so. I want to talk about the remote work issues that are going to impact your employee handbook, whether you call it remote work or work from home or telework. I don't know about you, but I thought it was really interesting when the Families First Act came out and telework was the way they described it, which I thought was kind of funny, as if everybody was, on the telephone the whole time instead of on their computer. The health and safety issues related to the pandemic and how that's going to impact your workplace and your workplace policies. And then, of course, diversity and inclusion concerns. These were really brought into sharp relief earlier in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I'd like to talk about how your handbook, your policies can really be possibly revised to benefit the organization. Okay, so first, remote work. Chances are pretty good that the remote work policy you had a year ago is no longer all that helpful. Some employers have always embraced working from home, but most saw it as really a temporary privilege for special situations with very tolerant supervisors and trusted employees, you know, really high performers, really limited to those situations. So this is a good time to think about how your organization will manage remote work going forward. And you know, when I think about employee handbooks today, I no longer think of it as something that you just look at once a year, at least not during this particular time in our history. You know, I think you could write a new employee handbook on the whiteboard every single day and erase it and start over the next day. We're in a really rapidly changing environment. And I think the remote work policy that you develop is going to be developed over time with a lot of input. You know, there are certainly some boundaries, some curbs you want to stay within, but I think it's going to be a work in progress for a little while. I think we've all accepted that we are not going to have a period of time where somebody comes on the television and announces that the pandemic is over and everything can go back to normal. I've heard it described as a hammer and a dance. You know, we'll go to work for a while, we'll do the dance, and then the hammer will come down and we'll all have to go back home again. So I think we want to look at this as always a work in progress. Okay, so here's a non-exhaustive list of things to consider as you retool your remote work policy. First, who decides? Is the decision as to whether a certain person can work from home driven by the company? Is it driven by the manager, or is it driven by the employee? And then, you know, you always want to keep in mind the legal risk of having non-exempt employees work from home. So as it becomes safe and as your organization determines that employees should be coming back, will non-exempt employees have an option at all to work from home? Do you have the infrastructure and policies to make sure that non-exempt employees are appropriately recording time? If you don't have those systems just now, can those be put in place? Is there time? Is there desire? Are there resources to implement some things so that you know that every phone call is tracked, every email answered outside regular hours, that the time is tracked? And I do realize that there is a de minimis exception for tracking time, but I don't think as an employer, as a responsible, something you want to rely on. I think you want to instruct employees to make sure that they are recording every last bit of time that they are that they are working for the company. And then, you know, of course, workspace requirements. If working from home is something that is done, you know, when this is, as this pandemic wraps up, will the company require evidence that an employee has an appropriate workspace, sufficient privacy for confidential work, phone calls, meetings? Will your company require that an employee provide evidence of childcare arrangements for young children? And if you require all of those things, how are you going to enforce it? I think if you're going to require those things, you should have a robust system of ensuring that those things are in place. Because if the company doesn't have a system of doing that, what you will end up having is a kind of an ad hoc system where employees tell on each other and report each other, or managers that are, you know, some managers will be more permissive than other managers. So, you know, and in the absence of a robust kind of enforcement system for what you expect in a home workspace, then let's have robust systems that are communicated to managers so that they understand what is appropriate and not appropriate if you're questioning an employee's performance from home, their workspace from home. Some things that you might consider requiring for work from home if you're going to allow it in the future is, do you require a certain level of internet service, and who's responsible for paying for that? Do you require that employees bring documents back to the workplace for secure shredding? Or maybe you send the shredding service to employees' homes to pick up any confidential documents that need to be disposed of in a certain way. And of course, making sure that the workplace is free from hazards. I think that employers had a little bit of a reprieve from that at the beginning of the pandemic, but at some point we need to get back to that, where we ensure that the workplace is safe, even if it is a home workplace. The other thing I think is key here is the availability and flexibility question. It really has to be explicitly addressed. Can the employer schedule in-person meetings at any time during regular work hours and expect the employee to show up? So let's say that you have a manager who wants to talk to the employee and decides, yep, this one's going to be an in-person meeting. Is it okay for me to just look at the employee's calendar, schedule a meeting, and say, this meeting isn't by Zoom or GoToMeeting. This meeting is going to be in person, so I'll see you in the office. And how much notice needs to be provided for that? I think it's very interesting right now that some employers are choosing to, abandon some of the larger office spaces that they have. And I think that's something to be addressed too. If an employee says, I want to work from home on a fairly regular basis, will they continue to have a place to work in the office? And I think that's something that can be addressed in your new remote work policy. And then, of course, we have to assess job categories and descriptions for handling work from home. Here, clarity around who's making the decision, and you really have to do a full analysis of job responsibilities, necessity of collaboration, equipment needs, confidentiality, all the things that we've talked about. Okay, some more here. Monitoring productivity. I think it's important to be really transparent about how managers and human resources will monitor productivity of employees who work from home. And if the way that the company monitors that is by some sort of tracking of computer activity, how many active minutes there are, what's the response time for emails, things like that. It is so important to be transparent about how the company is looking at that, so that people are aware. At some point, there needs to be an analysis with managers about the specifics regarding, what has been missing this year. If your workforce is largely working from home right now, what has been lost in terms of feedback and evaluation that maybe occurred in some more casual ways in the workplace conversation before. So figure out if those missing pieces can be reintroduced in a better remote working environment, or if in-person work is necessary. And one of the things that I have seen a lot in remote work policies from pre-pandemic is that there was a possibility of recall, that at any time a manager can say, we're not going to let you work from home. This is a privilege, we're rescinding it, we don't have to have a reason. So is that going to be the case going forward? Can that happen? Can we change the terms and conditions of a person's job like that by recalling them to the workplace without negative ramifications? Or will we still have sort of this trial basis that we had before, like, okay, for 3 months we will try this working from home arrangement, and if for any reason we don't like it, you have to come back to the office. I think you also have to consider whether hybrid options are something we want to take a look at. Does a person need to be in the office a certain number of days per week, per month, per year? And will the job description state that in-person work is an essential function for some jobs? Or will managers be able to make that determination? You know, I'm offering a lot of policy considerations, but I also want to provide my opinion on some of these things, and as an attorney, as an employment attorney. And from a risk mitigation perspective, my preference is for the standards to be set out in the job descriptions, so that, you know, as soon as someone takes a job, they know whether this is a job that the company would even consider for remote work. And that's based on the responsibilities of the position, the requirements of the position, and is not based at all on the preference of an individual manager. So, you know, this approach is certainly work intensive at the beginning, because it really involves every job category at your organization being analyzed. Of course, it depends on how big your organization is. If it's a 5-employee shop, it's not going to be all that work intensive. But if you have hundreds of employees, it's going to be a lot. But this process avoids the danger of an individual manager being accused of preferencing some employees over others, or treating people differently based on protected class considerations. So that's why it's my preference that we look at the job, the position, and that we not leave it up to the preference of a manager. Or, you know, the other thing that often comes into play is the performance evaluations. You know, there's a lot of, you know, kind of case by case determinations that are made as far as a manager saying, well, this employee can't work from home because they've had issues with productivity, performance, you know, with the idea that if they're here, so I can keep an actual eye on them, every moment their performance is going to improve. I really think that performance evaluations should be, and productivity should be kept out of the mix as much as possible, because if an employee is performing poorly, there is no way to know if they would perform better or worse in a remote working environment. And if performance evaluations are happening as they should, and they are accurate, and they're documenting problems, you can continue to do that after the person is working from home. And it may be that if performance suffers after the change to work from home environment, well, then you have a conversation with that employee and try to understand what the issue is. But to immediately jump to the conclusion that working from home is the cause of a performance issue, I don't think is correct. So I think for the most part that it should be sort of inherent in the job description, the position, not the individual manager, the individual employee, to determine whether or not someone can work from home. Of course, whenever you're talking about working from home, we have to talk about the exceptions here. And one thing that comes into play, of course, is accommodations. When you're deciding whether or not you're going to allow working from home, or what your remote work policy is. So, of course, prior to the pandemic, a very common request for a disability accommodation was to work from home, and employers commonly resisted this. They want employees that work. That's how we do business. Then, of course, last year, employer after employer sent everyone to work from home, not because they needed it as a disability accommodation. And so what we're asking ourselves now is, can we still have a policy requiring people to be at the office? Can we no longer say that working from home causes an undue hardship? So, practically it is going to be harder for an employer to assert that work from home is an undue hardship, but it's not impossible. Employers are still entitled to understand the disability-related limitation that necessitates an accommodation, And if there is no disability-related limitation requiring remote work, then no accommodation is required. It is as simple as that. So I advise that employers may still say, we don't allow work from home. You know, when we get to that point where in your organization, the workplace is safe, and if you want to require people to work in the office and you no longer want to allow working from home, you can still do that. There may still be disabilities that require the accommodation of working from home, but that is an exception from your policy. It doesn't have to be the rule. I also think that when you're looking at the teleworking issue here, you always have to be able to go back to the job description and say, what are the essential functions? So you want to be able to look at those essential functions and say, this requires a physical presence. And the last year, in some ways, provides an opportunity to go back and say, I can tell you why it's an undue hardship for this to be a work from home position, because these are all the things we lost in 2020 when this position was a work from home position. These are the meetings that didn't take place, the collaboration opportunities we missed, the face-to-face client interactions that didn't happen. And you may be able to point to your bottom line and say what the damage to the work environment, to the company, to profit was. Okay. When you're looking at work from home policies, we have to make sure that supervisors continue to supervise. I think that there is a good chance here that some supervisors have kind of enjoyed the isolation of working from home in some cases. They may have kind of reverted back to being what some companies call an individual contributor, you know, rather than a supervisor. You know, there's no employees here in my house, so I don't have any supervision responsibilities. People aren't popping into my office with issues anymore, and I'm kind of liking it. So we have to look at those disparities, the differences between taking advantage of remote work versus staying home due to legitimate concerns. So again, I think that the position is the key thing here, not manager preference, employee preference. A lot of people during the last year have gotten off schedule with performance evaluations. If you decide to continue a work from home policy, you want to go to you want to look at the performance evaluation process and make sure that those policies in your handbook and those employee policies address how performance evaluations and all those things will happen. Looking at the process for evaluation meetings, I think we've probably moved away from having all the people, quote unquote, in the room, and it's important to get back to that. If you always had the supervisor and then maybe the two-up supervisor in those meetings, make sure that those are accounted for again. And unfortunately, sometimes there still has to be disciplinary action. And I think that when you're looking at remote work, you want to look at new conduct guidelines. What are the expectations for video conferences? Is professional dress expected on a going forward basis? What is work time versus break time? And of course, the wage and hour issues that we discussed a little bit for non-exempt employees. And same with the evaluation meetings, the protocol for disciplinary discussions in terms of the confidentiality, giving an employee appropriate warning that this conversation with the supervisor is going to be different. This is a door closed conversation, making sure that people also have the support they might need after a difficult conversation. You know, I've advised a lot of employers on how to have disciplinary conversations, how to have termination conversations, and sometimes there is real and legitimate concern about what support that employee will have after the conversation. So I think that within your HR policies, it may be time to work that in if it's not there already. At the end of a difficult conversation, to say, you know, this has been a hard conversation. I can see that you're upset. Do you have a support person there at home? Can I call someone for you? You know, these are the types of human interactions that still need to happen even if we are not at the office. And I think it's the right thing to do, but I also think that from a risk mitigation perspective, those are really wise things to include. These are difficult times collectively right now. We know we need to be looking out for everybody's health and safety, and including their mental health. But when we get beyond this, the pandemic, and things are normal for the large proportion of us, everybody still has personal issues. Everybody still will, there still will be a need for those types of concerns to be addressed. And in a comprehensive remote work policy, in your HR policies, I think that's a really great thing to include going forward. And then before we move on to workplace safety, you know, HR itself is an area that has relied so much on face-to-face interactions. And if employees on a going forward basis are not in the workplace, what does it mean for HR to have an open door policy? What does it mean for HR to be the resource that takes reports, that takes complaints, that is the connection to an EAP, things like that. So I would encourage something that takes the place of that open door, whether it is office hours, whether it is reaching out to specific departments and you know, scheduling check-in meetings that normally you wouldn't have to, because you would normally see people along the way. So, and then of course the issue of HR needing to do investigations when there is a complaint. I think that if an HR investigation is taking place, I think there is still no real substitute from in-person meetings and interviews when the company determines that is this to do it. And so even if you're moving to a more you know, remote work on a more permanent basis, I would encourage you, and I would advise that investigations and interviews when someone has been accused of unfair treatment or believes they have been unfairly treated, I think those meetings, I think there's still a really good argument for having those meetings in person. Okay, so moving on to workplace safety. There is so much to consider here. You know, we're considering masks, distancing, protocols for cleaning, communication regarding exposures, positive cases, travel, when is it allowed, when do you have to tell people where you've been and who you saw, ventilation, how do we regulate the break room, is the lunch buffet over, how are we handling client events, how will we handle when some people are vaccinated, some people are not. There is just so much to consider here as you're looking at your policies. So as always, employers have to provide a safe workplace. And today that means following guidance from health departments, the CDC, and occupational safety and health. So the determination right now is, you know, what are you going to implement now as people come back into the office, and or if you already have been in the whole time. And I realize I'm talking to a great variety of employers here, and some of you may have never left the workplace, those of you with essential jobs and essential employees. But it's still important to decide, what are we going to do moving forward? Will you be requiring some of these well into the future? even after the pandemic has subsided. And you really want to be transparent in communicating with your employees. This is really an uncertain and stressful time, and clear, consistent communication all the way from the top can do a lot to alleviate stress. It also means adding some rules to your handbook about workplace conduct and disciplining employees who fail or refuse to follow rules to maintain distance, wear masks, and otherwise maintain a safe workplace. I have been answering so many questions from many employers who are very concerned that some employees will disregard or refuse to follow safety and health guidelines related to COVID. And, depending on where you are in the country, some people continue to insist that wearing masks is a personal choice, even though masks are there to protect others as much as to protect themselves. There's a lot of interesting arguments and analogies out there to promote mask wearing. Mine is a stop sign. It's not a personal choice to stop your car at a stop sign. It's against the law to not stop at a stop sign, and if you fail to do it, you endanger yourself and others on the road. So I think that if your policy in the workplace is to require masks, or in certain areas require masks, you have to treat it like any other workplace rule. So do you have guidance for addressing employees who refuse to wear a face covering, assuming that's required in your workplace? And, obviously, to begin with, you need to do your diligence to find out if there's a good reason for the refusal. So the employee may have a disability or a health condition that prompts the refusal, and then you can explore alternatives. So is the employee willing to wear a face shield, or could the employee perform his or her duties in an area of the workplace that does not require proximity to other people, a private office, an empty room, a cubicle surrounded by plexiglass or other barriers? And if the employee has no reason other than a personal choice to violate rules, then that conduct needs to be subject to discipline. So my suggestion in these cases has been to send employees home without pay, implement your no call, no show rules if subsequent absences occur because the employee fails to come to work or appears at work without the required face covering. So what are, and then the last thing I wanted to say just for this slide is that to communicate expected duration of these measures, if you can, or at least let people know when they are going to be evaluated again. So we're sitting here February 24th. You can say to someone, say to your employees that these are the rules for the next 30 days, 90 days. We will reevaluate at that point. Because I think we're all looking for a little bit of certainty in this world as to how long we have to do something, how long before we get to go back to a little bit more of a normal situation. And I think that even just giving people a date certain as to when there will be a new announcement from HR is pretty valuable. So now, obviously, looking at the most recent guidance from OSHA that is the thing to do. So as always, the workplace has to be free of hazards, and some states are even requiring COVID-19 safety training. The most recent guidance from OSHA advises that there should be a workplace coordinator who is assigned responsibility for COVID-19 issues. And I realize I am talking to HR folks out here, and so how many of you think that if your workplace designated a workplace coordinator that you would be that coordinator? Just raise your hands, even though I cannot see you. So I don't really think that this makes you feel like, oh good, there's going to be a coordinator and I'm going to have less on my plate, because chances are you will be that coordinator. The guidance from OSHA advises that there be a hazard assessment, that workplaces not only require, but that they provide face coverings. And while that seems like an extra requirement and an extra expense, what it does is it also takes away those workplace arguments about someone doesn't have an appropriate mask for the workplace, or someone has a mask that they shouldn't have, that should have been for healthcare providers. So if you want to, attempt to take on that issue by providing the required face coverings, it's not always a really bad idea. Your policies should also include a lot of communication, education, and training, as well as the policies for when is isolation required, when is quarantining required. And I'm not focusing a lot on leave policies and changing your leave policies here. For one reason, it's very state by state. Some states are requiring a certain amount of paid leave right now, even though the FFCRA requirements have expired. But the OSHA guidance itself is saying that you should have isolation and quarantine policies with non-punitive absence policies. So, depending on, you can interpret non-punitive many different ways. Does that mean that there will be paid leave that doesn't count against your normal, paid time off, sick leave? Or does it just mean that you're not going to be fired for missing work because you had COVID symptoms? So as you're looking at your employee handbook, you're looking at your policies, that is another area to really drill down on and decide, how do our leave policies need to interact with our health and safety policies so that people are not motivated to come to work when they are sick. And then, of course, not distinguishing between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated. That is another recommendation from OSHA. I can't claim to know all the science behind it, but I think the most up-to-date information is that even if a person is vaccinated, they may still contract the virus and be able to spread it. It's just that they themselves will not get as ill, hopefully. So there's still good reason to wear a mask and to social distance even after someone is fully vaccinated. As we are moving into a period of time where the vaccine is becoming more available to more people, the biggest question on employers' minds is whether or not to require the vaccine, or how to determine if they will encourage employees to get the vaccine. So, if you have had a policy in your workplace of requiring vaccination against influenza, for example, you're already a little bit further along in this process. But for most employers, if they're outside the healthcare or other high-risk area, vaccines have generally been left to an individual's discretion. So the important issue here is that, yeah, you can require people to get the vaccine. You obviously have to accommodate disabilities, you have to accommodate religious beliefs, always will want to check your state law, but requiring vaccination is permissible. A recent survey by the Society of Human Resource Management, this was early January, so my guess is that there are things that have changed since then, is that 61% of US employers intended to encourage but not mandate the vaccine, and at that point 35% had not yet decided. And among employees, 64% said they're likely to get the vaccine, which is a majority, that's great. And 24% said they would hesitate if they were mandated by the employer. They wouldn't like that. So obviously, if vaccines are required and health-related questions are asked, the employer must comply with the ADA. You have to show that it is job-related and consistent with business necessity. You have to keep the information confidential, and it's okay to ask for supporting medical documentation if someone says they have a disability. So what are these accommodations that you can offer if someone says they can't take the vaccine because of a disability? Well, they have to continue the mask mandate. They have to continue all social distancing requirements. Now, I don't really know that that's an accommodation, because I think that the the guidance from OSHA is that employers should be continuing those measures in any case, right? Whether you're vaccinated or whether you have the vaccination or not. But more likely you'd be looking at modifying the space, modifying the access to other people, perhaps allowing someone to work remotely when you would have otherwise required them to be in the workplace. Regarding religious accommodations, it's a little bit more difficult. They have to have a sincerely held religious belief, and you must accommodate unless it imposes an undue hardship under Title VII. And again, it may be all right to request supporting documentation. So as you're looking at your workplace safety policies, what you will require, what you won't require, you're between a rock and a hard place. You have employees and you have customers who may resist the policies that you are putting in place because they feel they are unnecessary or because they already are vaccinated. And then on the other side of it, you have employees who are pushing for more and more safeguards to be put in the workplace. So we have had thousands and thousands of federal OSHA complaints related to COVID-19, and there have been thousands more at the state level. And employers are stuck between there, trying to figure out how to keep doing business in a safe way and not drawing complaints. So one of the most recent cases is New York versus Amazon. And here they are alleging the non-compliance with cleaning and disinfecting requirements, both the CDC requirements and the Department of Health cleaning guidance. And they're also alleging failure to identify and notify potential contacts of infected workers. So that they failed to provide a log of people who had close contact, and they failed to identify, trace, and notify after a diagnosis. So when you're looking at the policies that you're putting in place for workplace safety, the best thing you can do is do yourself a favor and commit to a policy what you're going to do in terms of cleaning and disinfecting, with the CDC as your guidepost, as well as OSHA. And then how are you going to identify people and notify people when there has been close contact. So also in the Amazon case, the petition alleges that the company's discipline and productivity policies did not permit employees to observe hygiene, sanitation, and social distancing practices. They cite Amazon's relentless focus on productivity and the monitoring of time off task, or TOT. They also allege there was retaliation, including discharge from employment and disciplinary warnings against workers who complained. You know, as I was reading through the petition in this case, one thing that really jumped out at me was that apparently Amazon had actually quit monitoring this time off task, but they didn't tell their employees that. So if you were an employee in a warehouse at Amazon, you were still under the impression that you were going to be subject to discipline and that you were going to be negatively evaluated if your time off task increased. So the fact that Amazon wasn't monitoring that really made no difference because all the employees still thought they were. And it really brings into sharp relief the importance of being transparent about your policies, being transparent about how you are monitoring your employees. So if you are in the situation of needing to come up with a new policy right now, or multiple policies and lots of posters, so maybe even some table tents in the break room about your new workplace safety policies, here's a checklist. You know, what's required in terms of masks or protective equipment, what is required for distancing, Keeping in mind, in workplaces I have been in recently, sometimes people observe distancing in the hallway or when they walk into the reception area. But if they walk into a colleague's office, I've seen people take their mask off when they walk into an office, like, oh, well, that's just for the public areas. And then they also disregard the distancing. Talking about time off, off because of a potential contact with someone with COVID. How are we going to handle food? Is it still permissible to bring chocolate chip cookies from home and save and share them with everyone? Are we still going to have the community coffee pot, the community water cooler? What's going to change? Are we going to go back to more of those, single serve type things? What's expected in terms of visitors? Can my daughter still come to the office with me on occasion? Do we need to sign in? You probably have conference rooms. Is there a capacity? Have you looked at those conference rooms and said, okay, well, conference room A has this square footage. We've mapped out where people can sit safely and still observe social distancing. Does the policy provide for training on the specifics of the safety requirements? You have to address the vaccine. You have to address whether the employer is going to require it, encourage it, or leave it up to each employee's discretion as to whether to get it when it's available to them. How will we police symptoms in the workplace? If someone has symptoms of COVID or any other illness going forward, can they be sent home by saying, oh, looks like you're not feeling well today? I mean, that used to be just an expression of concern. Now, can it be followed up with, I'm going to ask you to go home for the rest of the day? What is our policy regarding travel, work and personal travel, and what do we have to inform human resources about if we travel overseas, if we travel to a different state, if we just travel within the state, but we're in an area with a lot of people, or because we were on a plane or a bus or a train. What's required in terms of contact tracing? And, the big thing that I think HR is going to be dealing with is when people report the violations of your health and safety protocols. And as I look at all these other things on the checklist, to me, it all comes back to what is reportable, what do we take seriously, what can our policy handle so that there's no more questions about it. And that's why I go to, kind of to the granular level of, is it okay to bring chocolate chip cookies from home and share? Because chances are you'll have people in your workplace who think that that is murderous activity. You will have others who believe that, what, if we can't share chocolate chip cookies, then why are we even here? So better to have that addressed in your policy rather than to have it addressed in a break room argument where things get heated and you have more to deal with than a food policy. And then retaliation against people who report. You have to, just like conduct based on protected class, we have to handle that. And then, of course, it is subject to change. It's subject to review. This is an ongoing process. So a little bit of time left here to talk about the big topic of diversity and inclusion. There is a great need right now to take a look at your policies surrounding diversity and inclusion, discrimination and harassment. You want to reduce the risk and the cost of litigation, certainly. You're going to be involved in setting diversity goals for hiring and promotion, for increasing inclusion. You need to make sure those policies and practices don't violate anti-discrimination laws. And inevitably, you want to make sure that the HR function in your company maintains its position and has a continuing and important role in working to diversify HR in your organization. So chances are you have a basic policy. You have a policy that says you may not discriminate against people, you may not harass people, and hopefully it requires training for new hires and current employees. We're seeing some states that have particular training requirements, and so presumably your policy handles that. And you have a basic process for reporting, investigation, and resolution. I would say that too many employee handbooks have, a 3-inch paragraph, depending on font size, that says we are an equal opportunity employer. We do not discriminate. There is equal opportunity, terms and conditions of employment. And sometimes that's it. Sometimes that is all there is in the employee handbook. And it is absolutely time to go beyond the basics. The workplace has changed. The expectations are different. The basic policy that prohibited severe or pervasive harassment and prohibited retaliation, just the bare legal standard is not enough. And if you need to convince leadership that more is necessary, tell them to consider the audience for this policy. It's employees, absolutely, but it is potential plaintiffs, it is opposing counsel, it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, your state or local civil rights commission, the judge, and the jury. And the policy is always going to be an exhibit, right? And it's always going to be the statement that your organization has put out to everyone about what the expectations are. So that policy that you have needs to do more than just have a paragraph that this is an equal opportunity employer. You have to lay the foundation. I would very much encourage you to have an introduction that states what the commitment is to a safe and welcoming workplace, that conduct based on protected class is not tolerated, will lead to discipline, and that the company supports and will recruit a diverse workforce. And that's often beyond what's in a basic policy. I firmly believe that training details should be in the policy. How often is it required? What is the employee responsible for getting done each year or every 6 months? Is this compensable time? I would agree it is. If you have, I would argue that it is, that if you have non-exempt employees, if they attend training beyond what is absolutely required, I think they should be compensated for that time, as well as for their time on any internal committees promoting diversity and inclusion. And those things can all be included in your policy in the employee handbook. And the more specifics you put in, the more you are requiring yourself to abide by that. Just extra for consideration, if you want to include in your employee handbook potential employee resource groups. Perhaps right now you just have 1 or 2, but making it clear to employees that if they would like to have additional employee resource groups, and these are voluntary groups for employees who share characteristics such as protected classes like gender or race, but it could also be people who care for elderly parents, people who care for a disabled child, a lot of those different things that provide support and community. These may be a resource for recruitment, retention, organizational strategy, but they do not have to be. It may be that these remain voluntary groups. You don't want to foist the organization's responsibilities on voluntary groups like this. I think that recruiting and hiring issues can also be included in policies. Your policy within HR and in your outward-facing policies, that job descriptions will be examined periodically, that you'll examine the search strategy every time, and that hiring personnel are accountable. Because when there's accountability, that means that it's part of their job, and so they can be evaluated on that. And then also within your policies is that you're going to enforce limits on checking social media, because so much is available on social media about an applicant that perhaps shouldn't be considered. And then demanding justification. It's not enough to say a person's not a good fit. And you also want to challenge the presumptions in a job description regarding, well, you have to have this degree, you have to have this experience, because you will have a larger and hopefully more diverse pool if you look at a wider variety of ways that someone can be qualified. So we still have 5 minutes left here. Anna, did any questions come in that I can try to address?
Yes, we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Our first question is, can an employee be fired for not attending in-person meetings or events because of their fear of contracting COVID-19?
Okay, yeah. So there's lots of things to touch on here as to whether, if they're not willing to come to the workplace after they're required to do so. And what was in that question, which is very key, is that it's because of their fear of contracting COVID-19. So I think the questioner did a good job of making their question clear, but just to make sure it's clear to everyone, this to me says this is not based on a disability. This is not based on a health condition or that makes them a high risk individual. This is not based on a religious issue, something like that. This is just based on a generalized fear of getting COVID-19. So, first you say, can they be fired? Well, hopefully it doesn't get to that. Hopefully you can, a supervisor can be supportive and come to a conclusion about what the right thing to do is. But if the employer has decided this is an in-person meeting, we need to have you here in person. And if the employer has done everything they can to make the workplace safe and is following those CDC and OSHA guidelines, yeah, you can discipline someone for refusing. Is there a risk to that? Absolutely. There's always a risk to that, because perhaps there is one element of the OSHA or CDC advice not followed. And I'm assuming the questioner is not an employee at Amazon, but obviously a lawsuit was filed there. I'm sure Amazon will say that they and has said that they provided a safe workplace, and that those in the class of complainants don't meet the requirements to not be in person at work based on that. But yes, you can take disciplinary action if someone refuses to come to the workplace, even though it's safe, and if you have a reason for doing so.
We have a follow-up to that question, and it says, what if they have a confirmed anxiety disorder?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So a confirmed anxiety disorder, well, that is a disability. So if they are requesting an accommodation for a disability, then you would need to go through that analysis. And that includes, what accommodations can be provided. Can you provide different, health and safety safeguards for that individual instead of not having them attend work? And is it an undue hardship such that you don't have to provide an accommodation? Whenever we're dealing with a disability issue, the interactive process is paramount. Making sure that, when the employee makes the request for accommodation, you go back and say, okay, well, I need the medical documentation that's necessary, and then you can go back with alternatives. Go back to that same disability interactive process that you always have.
Our next question is, do we need to add language about COVID-19 to our handbook?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question about whether we address a something that we hope is specific to a particular time. And I think that it's not necessary to use the word COVID-19 in your handbook. However, I think it's a really good idea to address the possibility of pandemics and global health situations in your handbook, because we can't say that we never knew it could happen now. So I don't think it's absolutely required that you use those words. I do think it's a good idea to address the possibility of pandemic in your policies. And of course, make sure that all your policies are always, these are subject to change at the employer's discretion. And when it comes to like those workplace safety guidelines and conduct, you can include those without specifically stating what you're talking about. I think we've seen workplaces take extensive measures when the issue is an extremely difficult year of influenza. And I like the idea that this past year will mean that our handbooks are more flexible and allow us to be more responsive to issues like that too. So I don't think you have to use the word COVID-19 in your handbook.
Okay, and then our last question for today is, how do you deal with employees working remotely from multiple states? Do I need to incorporate it into one handbook or create one from each state?
Unfortunately, that's something I can't answer because that's probably very state specific. There are lots of issues to consider there. And I think, some employers who have employees who are now working from other states have to deal with taxation issues. They have to deal with the specific employment rules in that state. And not every state, but some states are much more stringent than others in terms of whether they give up, jurisdiction of a case or something like that if it's brought in their state, but that's not where the employer is located, or the employee is only there temporarily. So unfortunately, that's not one I can really address. I apologize.
All right, and that looks like that was all of our questions for today.
Okay.